Hi, everybody. This is Katie Fitzgerald with Advanced CTE. So excited to talk a little bit today about communicating career technical education, learner-centered messages for effective program recruitment with my colleague, Stacy Whitehouse, Senior Associate for Communications and State Engagement. So we've got a lot to cover today, so we'll go ahead and get started. I see a bunch of people joining on, so we'll give it another minute or so. If you have questions throughout, feel free to throw them in the Q&A section. We're going to be covering a lot of kind of data sets alongside messaging and want to make sure that we're answering questions as we go. So feel free to drop those in anytime. And then, yes, this is being recorded. We also are going to share the PowerPoint afterwards. So if you have to leave early or you want to send it to your colleagues, you can feel free to do so. So we will go ahead and get started. So a little bit about Advanced CTE. If you're unfamiliar with us, we are a small kind of education association and nonprofit that represent state directors and state leaders of career technical education. So really those at the state level that are in charge of overseeing CTE. And as Sarah just put in the chat, feel free to let us know where you're from and who you are and what you're looking forward to, and that'll help guide our discussion as well. So what we'll do today is we will dig a little bit into the research that we just released yesterday on how to communicate effectively about career technical education. We'll talk through the key findings in that report. So going to go walk through a lot of data and really dig into how are we measuring effectiveness and satisfaction of those inside and outside of CTE programs, but with a special focus on historically marginalized populations. And then we'll have some tips so that you can begin putting this research into action, whether you come from kind of the state level, local level, or national level. So excited to see so many people from all over the country joining us today. So a little bit about how we got here. So in 2017, we were funded by the Siemens Foundation, who has been such a wonderful partner in this work, to really find out that why, despite kind of the decades of work to make career technical education a really high quality, equitable program that's a kind of preferred option for learners at the middle and high school level, that there's still kind of not a jump in enrollment numbers. Again, you all have done such great work really working on the program quality, yet it's pretty stagnant. And why this is a problem is not only because we believe that CTE is the preferred option, but also that employers are really having a hard time finding qualified employees for careers. Siemens Foundation is particularly interested in this because they have Siemens Corporation in the United States and really need to find people with high skill, high technical knowledge, high academic knowledge to work in their centers. And so we wanted to figure out, what is this stigma issue? Why is there this negative perception of career technical education? And how do we kind of get around this and get over this so that we can make sure that everyone has access and opportunity through CTE programs? So we did this research in 2017. A lot has changed in the world since then. And so we wanted to make sure that the data that we have from 2017, the message that we have from 2017 really still resonates in 2021. We wanted to confirm what families want in their education and their satisfaction level with certain aspects of their education, both in and outside of career technical education. We wanted to make sure that we're testing messages that are not only evergreen and really kind of have that message resiliency since 2017, but also are timely to the time that we're in right now. We've had obviously a huge economic downturn. The world of work and education has been totally flipped upside down. So are the way that we're talking about CTE right now as an option for everyone's education, the ways in which they're most resonating in the context that we're living in? And then, of course, we wanted to really drill down by different race, ethnicity, and income levels to make sure that not only are we communicating effectively about CTE, but that CTE students are satisfied across the board. And we found out some kind of major inequities there. So really excited to kind of dig into this research, talk a little bit about how to communicate with these different populations, and then some tips for you all to take home with you today.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and maybe morning for a few of you. Thank you so much for joining us. So many of you are probably familiar with our new vision for CTE. If you're not, I've put the link to it in the chat. Obviously, it's really important that we center our research and our work in the vision. And overall, just to advance building learner-centered systems, which this research obviously focuses on. So there's 5 principles in CTE Without Limits. We wanted to focus on 3 of them. The first one about cohesive, flexible, and responsive career preparation ecosystems. Obviously, families only know that if we communicate that effectively. And so the messages that resonate with families, we want to have them designed to reinforce the opportunities that are available in CTE and the cohesive paths, particularly from secondary to post-secondary education. The second principle obviously is very tied to equity, and our equity considerations in this messaging strongly encourage tailoring messaging so that it addresses barriers and concerns that families and learners have and helps them feel like there is a place in CTE for them. The third principle really emphasizes the messengers of CTE. Obviously, we want students to be able to make their own decisions about their education journey, and our research showed that both parents and learners believe that the learner is in the driver's seat about their education decisions. And so we need to give them the tools and informed messengers in order to do that. And so this research gives some insight on how we can make that happen. So just wanted to quickly highlight the terms that we're going to use today. This research focused on middle and high school families. Prospective means that the family is currently not participating in CTE, and current means they're participating in one or more classes. So not necessarily a concentrator, but participating in some way. And finally, we just wanted to give an overview of the methodology. Like last time, we did have focus groups. These were conducted virtually, of course. Our research was conducted in late fall of 2020. We also did a national online survey, and in both cases, it was tilted more towards prospective learners. The key difference with the 2017 research is this round had an oversample of Black, Latinx, and low-income families. And this is a nationally representative survey. We sometimes get questions of, would this apply to my state? And it is nationally representative. And in the last round, there were 5 to 7 states who did their own research, and their findings strongly paralleled what our national survey found. So that's great news as to its impact.
Great, so now we're going to dig a little bit into the findings. So we just released a report yesterday that goes more in depth into what we're going to cover today. So highly encourage you to take a look at that. And again, if you have questions on any of these slides, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A section, and we'll take those as we go. So what's great news is that despite kind of all the challenges that we've had in education in the workforce and all real systems really in the last year, is that CTE still delivers for families. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen that about half of current CTE parents and students are very satisfied with their overall school experience, about 88% satisfied, and less than a third, 28% of prospective parents and students are very satisfied with their overall school experience, about 75% satisfied. So a huge kind of satisfaction increase among those involved in career technical education. I think this is particularly unique given the tumultuous year that we've had, the things that make really CTE really unique, like exploring careers and gaining skills. You can see on the right side, students involved in CTE programs are much more satisfied with those opportunities, which is really impressive given that educators and administrators and states had to really pivot to this kind of hybrid in-person virtual learning, and still students are far and away more satisfied with being involved in CTE. So great news there. This is a tiny bit lower as compared to the research we did in 2017. I would imagine that doesn't have to do with the quality of CTE dropping. I think that more has to do with kind of the disruptions in education that were faced, but it wasn't a huge significant drop by any means. I think what's also impressive is that we tested a bunch of different indicators, and then not only are students more satisfied with things like opportunities for internships, which we know that happens through CTE, opportunities to learn real world skills and make connections with and network it with employers. They're really satisfied with their whole education experience. So that's the overall education experience, quality of their classes, quality of their instructors, and really impressively, opportunities to take advanced classes. I think often when we hear from folks at the local and state level, it feels like there's this kind of competition between kind of AP and advanced coursework and CTE, depending on how it's set up in the middle and high school level. And we're finding that even those that are involved in CTE programs still feel like they're getting that academic rigor, they're getting to earn college credits, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of, in some cases, we're seeing kind of a false dichotomy there. Here's just a couple of facts that we have. As I mentioned, about twice as satisfied as being involved with CTE as those not involved in CTE. 85% of families participating in CTE are satisfied with opportunities to take classes to do skill building, which we'll talk about in a second here. And then 84% of families participating in CTE are satisfied with opportunities for career exploration. So we'll talk a little bit about the nuances about how to message kind of skill building versus passion and career exploration kind of along the career journey. But again, a great opening for CTE here that it really still delivers for families across the board. Our next finding is that the same as 2017 is that families are attracted to the real world benefits of CTE. So we'll really dig into this in terms of the kind of the messages, the themes and words that people want to hear. But we did test 22 indicators, had people rank kind of their top benefits of CTE, and preparing for the real world was still the top message chosen by over 60% of both prospective and current families. It was especially effective for prospective families and most effective among prospective Latinx families, which we'll talk about. It was chosen as the top desired benefit and outcome for CTE. And families viewed career exploration and skill building as key aspects to preparing for the real world. So how do all those things combine is what we'll talk about.
So the preparing for the real world is kind of that top level message. And so the second layer is talking about what's most important to families in their education. And as was mentioned in the last slide, obviously the good news is that the things that make CTE unique, which is career exploration and gaining skills, were also the top aspects for families that they're looking for in their education. This chart shows the top categories that parents listed as their top two as the most important aspects of their education. As you can see, career exploration and gaining skills are at the top, and that's over opportunities like participating in extracurricular activities or participating in sports. Those are down at the 20% level, whereas the CTE categories are up at the 45 to 50% level. One thing I do want to point out is sort of there's a nuance between prospective and current families in how they emphasize these categories. As you can see, prospective career exploration is at 50%, whereas it's 40% for current families. It's a little bit smaller gap for gaining skills of 51% for current and 46% for prospective. But that just kind of emphasizes, and it's not too surprising, that prospective families, they may not fully know what opportunities are available in CTE, or they're still trying to figure out what career they want to follow. And then current families, they may have picked a path, and so they're looking to gain those skills and find opportunities to really pursue the career that they want. So just an important note for states and localities of how they're designing their materials and just being cognizant of the phase of messaging that their learner may be in. So the other aspect of this and what families found to be most important that we really want to drive home, and I think is a messaging shift that a lot of folks may need to make, is finding passion is also a top priority for families. While they want to get that real world skills to prepare them for the real world, and that was a top message across the board, right behind that was they want to find their career passion. And that again was based out of the 22 options. What stands out, this was ranked above a well-paying job, earning college credit, and having experiences that stand out on applications, which are all things that we talk a lot about when it comes to CTE, but it's important to remember that they're just like any other high school student. They're trying to find their way, and they want to find something that they're interested in. And so obviously, states and localities talk to a lot of stakeholders. We talk to policymakers, we talk to industry, and there's some messages that really resonate with them to help advance CTE's impact and create partnerships. And those are really important. But it's also important to let them know that when they're communicating with families, they want to hear about the passion. They want to hear about how this is connected to something that they're excited about. So the chart below also just kind of summarizes the top benefits that we found in the research. So preparing for the real world, finding career passion, but also the other things we talked about earlier, learning life skills, getting hands-on experience was just another great reinforcer of what CTE has to offer to get those skills, and then discovering the right fit for your career.
Yeah, I just want to drive home what Stacy just said about kind of the passion piece and skill piece messaging better above kind of well-paying job. This is really I guess a little bit surprising is that we went through a lot of focus groups. A lot of parents and guardians that we talked to were furloughed or had lost jobs or had lost hours, and still far and away passion and skill building are things that families value over paycheck. So we tested this in 2017. It made sense in 2017. I thought that kind of paycheck and stability and those types of things would test better this go around, because we're really in the throes of COVID when we did this research. And this might be much different for post-secondary audiences that are looking to upskill and reskill, right? But I think when we're talking about middle and high school students, it's still so important to drive home the passion piece over kind of conversations we've had in the past about, okay, you can graduate high school with a certification and then get this, career that's $60,000 a year, and you're going to be set for life. And that's not really the aspiration for learners, and it's really not the aspiration for parents and guardians. And so this is kind of a messaging piece that we think is important, is that, we're talking about CTE in a way that's not fully resonating with the beneficiaries there. So just really wanted to drive that home, that context around the paycheck in this economy that has been so difficult for so many people, really not resonating still.
And I think it also speaks to, obviously, we've heard a lot about student engagement in COVID, and obviously CTE has a huge opportunity to just tap into that with this passion message, that we have the opportunities for them to have an even more engaging education experience.
Great. And then I do see a question in the chat about perspectives on connecting CTE students and families and businesses seeking to build their prospective future employee pipeline. So that's a great question. We are going to talk a little bit from the learner and parent and guardian side about this idea of making connections through things like internships, hands-on training, mentorships. We'll talk about some data there. As part of this, we did do a really small study of about 200 or 300 employers where we gauged kind of their perceptions of CTE, which is going to come out this summer. Far and away, employers are super into CTE. They think it's a good way to build their talent pipeline. We just haven't quite released that research yet. So great question. And we will be sure to share that with participants afterwards. So another finding that we have from this research that resonates with our findings in 2017 is that college and career success matter to families. And so about 78% of prospective families and 85% of families currently participating in career technical education expect to pursue some level of post-secondary education. So again, this is a lot different than we're sometimes talking about CTE as a kind of a more terminal program, as kind of an alternative to post-secondary education. And while that may be true, while there are certainly high quality programs that don't require post-secondary education, we really need to meet families where they're at. And far and away, they still see post-secondary education as their next step after middle and high school. However, there are some major differences compared to our research in 2017. You can see on the left-hand side on the bottom of the screen, about 60% of prospective and current families in 2017 envisioned a four-year degree as that post-secondary opportunity. This has dropped pretty significantly in 2020, with about 46% and 52% planning to do a post-secondary or a four-year degree. So I think this is a nuance that we have to be careful about, right? We can't lose the conversation around post-secondary education, but there are other openings for talking about things like area technical centers, community college, certification programs, et cetera, et cetera. And I think a bigger appetite for those type of programs in this environment. You can also see on the right-hand side, families in CTE are more certain about their post-high school plans. About 3% of prospectives were unsure versus 13%. I'm sorry, 3% of currents were unsure versus 13% of prospective families. And again, families are more open to post-secondary paths other than a four-year degree. I think what is great is that CTE learners are prepared for college. So we see here that CTE learners and their parents and guardians are more satisfied with opportunities to prepare for college through things like advanced classes and college credit. And CTE learners and their parents and guardians are more confident about completing a post-secondary degree. So this is really bridging the gap between those that want to go to college and want to go to post-secondary education. They feel more ready and more prepared to actually do that. You can also see on the right-hand side, over 80% of families currently in CTE are satisfied with opportunities to earn college credit and take advanced classes compared to only 60% of prospective families. So I think this also demonstrates we've done a lot of work, right, to build those pathways and those transition points between middle and high school and post-secondary education. And this is really coming through in that learners feel ready and satisfied and prepared to move on.
Thanks, Katie. So obviously these are all great messages, and it shows the progress that I think we've made on the programmatic side. And one of the keys is making sure that the messengers that families see as go-tos are equipped with those messages and fully informed about, yes, CTE does lead to post-secondary paths, and there is more satisfaction in people's education's experience. And so we, again, this time asked families who are their go-to for information about CTE. It's a little bit of a change from 2017 when we asked who is most trusted, but I think we actually got a little bit more nuance out of this answer. The good news is for states, I hope that it doesn't necessarily have to be a huge ad campaign or a lot of money in order to build awareness for CTE and inform messengers. Teachers and counselors were far and away the top sources across participation, race, ethnicity, and income as the go-tos for families to learn more about CTE. I'll talk a little bit about some equity considerations that are in there, but it was still the top choice, and great for us because one of the projects that was piloted in the last round of research was a career advising curriculum that we're in the process of transferring to a virtual platform. So keep an eye out for that as kind of a stepping stone to building on this finding. Another obviously valuable point is that learner voice is really important in recruitment strategies, and CTE learners and alumni were a top 5 source for both prospective and current families. And not too surprisingly that parents were more likely to just consult a larger network about CTE, such as employers and community organizations. One other thing that I want to point out that we'll talk about a little bit later is the online sources. As you can see, the 4th and 5th top sources were Google searches and websites, and that just kind of reinforces how important it is to communicate your message across multiple platforms, to be consistent about your messaging, and that some audiences may prefer that more than others, which was definitely the case here. It was ranked even higher among some groups. So we'll delve a little bit more into that later on in the presentation. At this time, we'll stop for a moment and see if people had any questions about the research findings. We know this was a lot to digest before we break down the messaging and the equity considerations. And feel free to do it in the chat or in the Q&A.
Looks like Victor dropped a link in the chat to a little bit about his program. So thanks for doing that, Victor. Any questions on the research that we've covered so far? If not, we can go ahead and keep going. Will we have access to all the options for this and previous slides? Yes, we sure will have everything recorded and sent to you all after this. At the very end of this presentation, we'll talk about some resources we've developed for you to kind of get some of this research off the ground, which I'll be happy to share as well. So thanks for asking that, Jackie.
So now we'll go into a little bit more detail about, oh, Mary had a question real quick.
Yep. So do you want to answer this, Stacy?
Sure. I was just going to say that we did not ask that question. It was more general categories of who are the go-to sources. We didn't break down the individual source by race. I believe that's what you're asking, but there are some racial implications that we will go into.
Great question. And then Shell asked, have you looked at families who are not participating in CTE? So yes, I'm sorry that's not clear. So when we're talking about prospective families here, we're talking about those that are not involved in CTE as compared to current families. So that's kind of the data that we're comparing, is those not involved in CTE versus those involved in CTE. So thanks for asking that so that we can clarify. And then how are families defined in research? Parents and students together, or just one or the other? I believe it's parents and students together, but we also did not just do parents this time. We also kind of broaden it to guardians, so that if you have a grandparent taking care of you, or a different caregiver, that we're making sure including those perspectives as well.
Now, great question on the nuance. Families does mean learners and parents, guardians combined, and then we separate the two categories if there's something that we're mentioning specifically about each group.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for asking those clarifying questions. That's really helpful. All right, so I think we'll keep on going. Feel free to drop in any more questions as we go. So now we're going to really transition so we've got this great data where we see that CTE is really delivering. So how do we talk about this? What does this mean for us? And so Stacy's going to talk through a little bit about what the messages we tested were, how we got to where we are, and then how to use those messages.
So there were 3 messages that we tested: prepare for the real world, safe bet in this economy, and making connections. We really wanted to have some simple thematic messages that were easy for state and local systems to use, in addition to kind of the layering about career exploration, skill building, and passion that we talked about. This is cut down from the research we did in 2017. The research we did in 2017 had some more options for the financial benefits, adding CTE to your high school experience, getting a leg up. And we found that, as was mentioned before, preparing for the real world really stood out, and those other messages didn't resonate as well. And so we wanted to make things more thematic and also maybe a little bit more current to what was happening in the world right now. So in addition to doing a force rank of what's your 1, 2, and 3 choice, we tested each of the messages for believability, personal connection, relation to current education experience, and likelihood to enroll in CTE. And I think the good news is, like, all 3 of them were effective in those ways. It's just there's one that stood out much higher than the rest of what resonated the most. So I know this font's a little small, so I'll read through all this. Just wanted to go into a little bit more detail about why we chose each message. Obviously, the first one was because it was the top message in 2017. And because of everything that has happened in the world in the past year, we wanted to know, is that general message about cultivating real world skills and practical knowledge, especially when students haven't been able to be in the classroom as much, like, does that still resonate with what they want most from CTE? Safe bet in this economy, we were trying to explore in the aftermath of all the transformations that happened in the world of work, and some of the messaging we've done about CTE's role in the economic recovery is, when it comes to the economy, whether things are going well or things are going not so well, our parents reassure that CTE is always an option and can always deliver results for their learner. And is that what they're looking for more now as they try to figure out, how's my learner going to prepare for the next stage of the world of work? The final one was inspired by the focus group responses, making connections. We heard a lot from learners, just the value of being able to build relationships with like-minded peers and instructors and employers, and just the unique aspect of those experiences. And so obviously we also know the value, and there's a lot of research out there about the value of social capital, but also the barriers that historically marginalized populations face from accessing that social capital, both in secondary and especially post-secondary education situations. So we wanted to also test, is that something, making the connections, the message that resonates the most? So I'll have Katie talk a little bit about our top message.
Great, thanks, Stacy. So you can see here, and this might be a relief to some states, so I know who we've worked directly with on kind of message resiliency over the last 4 years, is that prepare for the real world still far and away is the top ranked choice by all of the subpopulations that we tested for. So you can see 64% of prospective families selected prepare for the real world as their top message, 56% of current families, and then about 70% of prospective Latinx families. So that really resonated with that group. You can see that making connections was significantly lower, but there's a lot of nuance there that we'll talk to in terms of when you're kind of trying to target and reach different subpopulations. And then safe bet in this economy was right under making connections. In some cases, further under, depending on further down in the list, depending on who we're talking to. So we'll talk about some nuances there too. So I think this is great in that preparing for the real world is evergreen. It's a message that you can rely on across the board. As Stacy, I think, mentioned earlier, a lot of states and locals ask us, okay, well, this national research is great, but will this work for me? And we say yes. This worked 4 years ago. It's nationally representative, so you can feel good about using the message prepare for the real world. Making connections, we'll talk a little bit about kind of that value of social capital and why we still think that's an important piece of the conversation as well. So what does prepare for the real world look like in terms of a message? I'm going to go ahead and read it because I think the whole message is important, but it gives purpose to learning by emphasizing real world skills and practical knowledge. Students receive hands-on training, mentoring, and internships from employers in their community, and it helps students explore different options before they start college or career and get them ready for the real world. So I think part of the reason this is evergreen is that everyone has really had that experience where you want to find out how what you're learning in the classroom really applies to what you're going to do after high school. And so I think this is a perfect example of this is so unique to CTE. There are very few other high school opportunities to find out this, and that connection to employers is so important. So things like hands-on training, mentorship, and internships, which is also pretty unique to CTE. So really want to drive home those pieces of why we think this message really resonates with families, is that kind of tangible benefits that people are leaving middle and high school with. And you can see a couple of quotes we have from a prospective parent and a prospective learner of like kind of finding out what you want to do before you invest in your post-secondary or post-high school kind of options. And then also kind of a little bit of dissatisfaction with school systems teaching students about real world problems or issues. So this is just kind of some qualitative information and some quotes from those audiences. A little bit about kind of your key 3 messages. This is a message triangle, also known as key 3. And what we know is that people can't really digest more than 3 messages at once. And so we really tried to distill all the research that we found from the focus groups and the national survey into how do we talk about CTE that we think is most effective with families. And so this is pretty similar to our message triangle in 2017. There's a little bit of difference, which I'll talk about in a second, but it's really this idea that CTE learners explore careers to find their passion, gain real world skills, and have more options for career and college success. So this is a little bit different in that in the message triangle in 2017, CTE delivers was at the center. And what we decided, we've done a lot of internal and external work around equity and kind of making sure the learner is centered in everything that we do. And we decided, okay, CTE does deliver, we know that, but they shouldn't be centered in the conversation. Really, learners should be. So that's the big pivot there. And then we wanted to make sure that this idea of finding your passion was also elevated. It wasn't in the key 3 messages in 2017, but if it's so apparent that passion is still important in this economy, then we think it's really worth talking about this piece as well. So if you are using the messages from 2017, you can still feel really good about them. This is just a way to kind of update and refresh the way that you're talking about CTE in a new way. So again, language that works, real world skills, explore careers for a path you're passionate about, getting hands-on experiences, leading to fulfilling, rewarding careers, being prepared for college, enhancing your high school experience, making valuable connections, and being prepared for the real world. So now Stacy's going to really dig into kind of the equity considerations. And if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and drop them in the chat as we go.
Yeah, so take a snapshot of that messaging triangle. This section is not meant to change that at all. It's really meant to tailor your messages to help make learners and families feel welcome and to address the barriers and needs that they may have to see CTE as an option. The first one is a finding that we were kind of hoping not to see, but it's one that we feel is really important for states to know about. On the positive side, the things that make CTE unique, career exploration and gaining skills that families also find the most important, had equitable differences in satisfaction from prospective learners over to current learners. I want to start this by saying that this finding was really focused on learners. We didn't see the things I'm about to discuss so much in parents, but I think that's because they're not as immersed in the hands-on learning experiences. They may hear about it, but they're not there in the day-to-day experience. The challenges is that white learners had significantly higher differences in satisfaction than Black and Latinx learners. And so that shows that there is a quality problem, whether it's in access or the types of experiences that learners are able to access in their programs. And obviously that's something that states can take a huge lead on in trying to use data to identify gaps in the programs and also just evaluating who has access to these programs. The next slide, I'm just going to show the data that kind of backs this up. So internship opportunities and making connections with employers. White learners, you can see, had over 30% increase in satisfaction from prospective to current learners. It was a lot less for Latinx learners. You can see that it's 12% and 6%. Even more troubling findings for Black learners, where there was actually a drop of 1% and 2% between prospective and current learners. So that means there was no increase in satisfaction, and actually they were less satisfied. So that's a really concerning finding, and it means that the messages about making connections or pushing hands-on experiences are not going to be as effective as if we can't address the quality gaps in this program. So that's kind of the top equity consideration that we really wanted to push. The second point is a bit of a more positive note and goes back to what we talked about earlier with CTE, helping learners to prepare for and complete college. And so we kind of broke down the data a little bit more and highlighted Latinx families and families experiencing low income. Latinx parents in particular were very high in their levels of choosing that their learner would only complete some college instead of completing a certification or a 2 or 4 year degree. And obviously that's concerning when you're a prospective parent, and obviously post-secondary education is a concern for you. The great news is that the data show that CTE helped to close those gaps. So when it came to plans to actually complete a 2 or 4 year degree, Latinx families increased from 36% for those not in CTE to 60% for those in CTE. And then families experiencing low income, those outside of CTE, were only 42% saying that they would complete a degree versus 55% of those currently in CTE. So that's great news. It again reinforces how important post-secondary education is to families, but also that states and localities need to work together to make sure that they're specific about the options that are available, so that some of the barriers that families feel they may be facing in post-secondary education, they know there's more variety and flexibility, and that CTE prepares them to pursue that path. The third consideration goes back to the messenger piece. I mentioned that there are some nuances among some of the findings. The first one was about the school-based messengers. Again, this is an area of concern, and there's probably several reasons for it. There was a difference in trust between those that were likely to access school counselors. Black and Latinx parents and guardians were significantly more likely to access counselors than learners were. And yes, we'll be sharing these stats after the webinar. They'll all be in the PowerPoint. I'm going to read out some stats now. We'll make sure that they're added. So for this particular category, just to kind of drive home how big the gap was with Latinx families in particular. So 84% of Latinx parents and guardians that aren't in CTE were likely to talk to a school counselor about CTE options, but only 37% of learners would. 74% of Black parents and guardians said that they would consult a school counselor, but only 59% of learners would. I think some of this could be contributed to COVID and just the relationship that learners may have that's different and just not as meaningful because they're not in person. But especially with the Latinx, that is too big of a gap, I think, to just contribute to COVID. And it just reinforces the importance that I know states are doing and just driving home of how important quality and just having learners see themselves in their messengers are in these communications being effective and just building more diverse and equitable pipelines for instructors and counselors. The other point I wanted to elevate, and this may not be too surprising considering the previous finding, is that online sources of information about CTE were considered top 2 sources among several historically marginalized groups. So Black prospective families experiencing low income, and Black prospective parents and guardians all ranked them in the top 2. So they had them right up there with teachers and counselors. So that just kind of reinforces what I mentioned before about how the communication avenues need to connect with each other and reinforce the messages, and that some groups, if they're not feeling as comfortable accessing a school-based source, that they will go online, and so the information needs to be digestible. We all know we use some terms and programs that families may not fully understand if they're outside of CTE, so just making sure that states can support localities in displaying information in the best way possible. Finally, we want to go back to the making connections piece, and we mentioned that it does matter to families, and particularly learners from historically marginalized communities. And I think this is great news because it shows just the power of CTE to bridge equity gaps and the importance of hands-on experiences in making and building relationships. So while preparing for the real world was a universal top choice, Black, Latinx, and those experiencing low income had a higher percentage of those choosing this over an economic message than white learners did. So you can see from those 2 charts, white learners that were in perspective families only chose this 1% over the economic message, whereas those that are Black and Latinx learners chose it by 8 and 9%. It was even more prominent among current learners. You can see for Black and those experiencing low income, it was 18, 19%, which shows again that if quality is at the forefront, that students can really get the most out of these programs and are really seeing the benefits of social capital and making connections. So good news and things to work on in both these cases.
Yeah, we also think this could be a good message as you think about program and student retention. And so not only kind of encouraging learners to get into CTE programs, but, complete a pathway and a program of study, et cetera, et cetera. And so we think that this is a good space to really drive home the opportunity of making connections kind of over the economic message as well. So a little bit about how to put this research into action. I know this is a lot of information, but we've got it all laid out in a beautiful report that we just released yesterday, which you can read kind of in depth, and we go through more of the kind of equity considerations per finding. So really encourage you to do so. We've got do's and don'ts, which I'll talk about in 1 second. We've got a fact sheet with a lot of these statistics. So as you think about kind of making the case, not only with families, but also with policymakers and employers and other stakeholders, we know that CTE delivers. And so we should really be shouting that from the rooftops and making sure that people know that this is still kind of the preferred option for people's education. In the next couple of months, we'll have a messaging card and a social media guide and a video. So looking forward to sharing that with you all soon. So a little bit about do's and don'ts. So as you think about, I know kind of the data might be a little bit overwhelming. Kind of what do you do tomorrow if you were to write something that would be targeted towards families? So I think that kind of top for us is being consistent and reinforcing key messages. So when you think about that message triangle, yes, there's nuances among kind of different subpopulations that you'd be communicating to. How do you really contextualize that for your state and for your programs? How do you use those themes and those ideas of career exploration, finding your passion, real world skills, and college and career success, and really connect it to the way that you're serving students in your state? How do you also lift up learners to tell CTE success stories? So thinking about CTSOs, alumni of your programs, and really making sure that those messengers are a part of your outreach. Being specific to how CTE works, particularly hands-on experiences. So I think work-based learning, hands-on learning, training, mentorship sounds amazing. It's a big draw for families. But when you're talking about at the state or local level, being really specific on what that looks like. Who are the employers that are involved? Do those employers have name recognition in your region? We did a study in 2017 when we did this focus groups. We tested kind of a school program that we work with regularly and tested kind of the idea of this program on as a message with families that were like 30 miles away. And they're like, okay, well, this sounds great, but this is not in my community, so it does not resonate with me. And so I think, thinking about the state level, you got to kind of have more vagueness around that. But as you're supporting the local level, helping them really understand the value of being super specific about what those opportunities look like is really important. Again, emphasizing CTE learners are more satisfied with their education, and then emphasizing CTE's value of preparing for college and career success. So a couple of the don'ts, again, positioning CTE as college and career, not either or. Positioning CTE as different from a high school experience. So we tested a message in 2017, and I think this is a lot of times how we talk about CTE is if you're unsatisfied with your high school experience or you want something different, then sign up for CTE. And what we find is that, from the PDK poll and other research, that most people really just want a normal high school experience. And so we can't set up a CTE as different because then it's looked at as lesser. Those that has kind of baggage with vocational education, with a lot of kind of equity considerations. But in today, we really need to make sure that we're kind of driving home that CTE is a part of a normal high school experience. Yes, you may be driving to a technical center or have shared spaces, et cetera, but it's not a different high school experience. It's a value add. Stacy and I talked about this a lot, but don't push the financial benefits of CTE over things like career pathways or finding your passion. We did some testing around in 2017 around kind of investing in yourself before you get into post-secondary education. And I think it muddied the waters a little bit. And I think it really just kind of demonstrated that career passion is still important over paycheck. Don't do all the talking and elevate the learner voice. Be sure that you're really tailoring your messages based on those equity considerations that Stacy mentioned. And then don't forget about retention. So getting learners into CTE programs is wonderful, but to keep them there, we need to really make sure we're driving home kind of that skill building piece and then also the making connections piece as well. So a little bit about how to implement in your state, or if you're at the local level, this would apply to you too in some cases. So certainly sharing with stakeholders who communicate with families about CTE. We know that sometimes our best and most passionate advocates aren't always the ones that are talking about it in the way that most resonates with families. We are opening a request for proposals for technical assistance with strategic communications to be released next week, I believe May 7th. So if you're at the state level and you're the Perkins eligible agency, then we encourage you to apply. I know that we have some former grantees that are on this webinar right now, and you can apply again as well too. And so excited to kind of kick that off. We will educate teachers and school counselors about CTE through our career advising curriculum. We've kind of delivered it to 600 school counselors in 2019. It used to be in person. It no longer will be, at least in the short term. So we're putting that online, and then we'll be delivering it through states and local school districts. We encourage you to review and refresh your communications materials. So a lot of what you already have, if you based it on the 2017 research, still resonates, but we can see that there's some updates here that we think will be really powerful with communicating with families, reviewing recruitment data, identifying equity gaps in access and participation in developed targeted recruitment campaign. As Stacy mentioned, you can have the best communications campaign on the planet, but if you are not trusted by the beneficiaries, and if there are major equity and access gaps to students, then you can communicate however long you want, but it's not going to be satisfying to different types of subpopulations that you're trying to reach. So really focusing on equity and quality as you build and deliver your programs is so important. And then consider ways to receive feedback from families and elevate the learner voice in your recruitment process. So thinking about those feedback loops, and then how do you really get those stories and share them at the state and local level. And that's it. So if you have any questions, feel free. We've got a few minutes left. Happy to answer them. We did have a question which I answered in the Q&A of how many students were in the national survey, and there are 2,100. So I hope that you got that answer. And then any other questions for Stacy and I? Happy to answer them.
Katie, do you want to talk at all maybe about how some of the states utilized this research last time in the RFP?
Sure. So we have been working with states over the past couple of years to kind of pilot and test different recruitment strategies that are really anchored in the national research. And so they did it through a variety of different ways. We've got New Jersey on here, Lori, hello Lori, who piloted a series of kind of in-person career advising events, but made sure that because the population that they were speaking to was mostly Black and Latinx, that the speakers also reflected that. So it seems simple, but the intentionality around that is so important and is something that we often miss, and had some other great resources for students as well. Arkansas is another state that we worked with that was wonderful, and who created a really cool social media Twitter campaign based on kind of this idea that CTE rocks. So I'm happy to share more about that as well. But I think, far and away, what is so important for me is that at the state level, you're really thinking about integrating these into kind of your statewide communications, and then figuring out how to kind of best support local school districts and implementing as well, because we know that can't always use Perkins Fund for marketing. You may not have state funding, you may not have local funding. That's where we come in, and that we've created a ton of off-the-shelf materials on our website, which we can drop in the chat, but want to make sure that you have kind of the support to do that work as well. Great, and a couple of questions about the recording. Yep, we'll have the recording after this soon. All right, well, I think that's about it. Great. Well, we really appreciate you all taking the time today. We've got a busy schedule, and there's Zoom fatigue is real. So really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join this. We'll be sharing everything after this. We've released a ton of resources, as I mentioned, so we can share that as well. And of course, if you are a state leader, then we encourage you to apply for the RFP next week. And Stacy and I are happy to answer any questions you have offline as well. So thank you so much.